It's 1898. In a quiet German lab, a young chemist carefully lifts a glass vial filled with a clear, shimmering powder. He believes he's done it. He's created a medicine that will end pain, cure addiction, and make life just a little easier for everyone. His company, Bayer, calls it a miracle. The newspapers call it a breakthrough. The world calls it heroin. Yeah, that went about as well as you'd expect. Once upon a time, not even that long ago, people thought science could fix anything. Doctors were trying to cure pain, coughs, and all kinds of diseases, and they thought chemistry was the key. So when a German company announced they'd made a brand new medicine that could relieve pain without addiction, everyone celebrated. They sold it as a cough syrup, as pain drops, even as medicine for children. People trusted it. After all, it was made by Bayer, the same company that gave the world aspirin. How bad could it be, right? Well, give it a few years, and that miracle turned out to be one of the most destructive drugs in history. Heroin went from a trusted medicine to a street drug that ruined lives across the globe. In this video, we're diving into the complete history of heroin, from its bright beginnings in a German lab to the dark corners of addiction, crime, and the modern opioid crisis. It's a story of good intentions gone horribly wrong, and a reminder that sometimes even the smartest people can make the biggest mistakes. So, grab your blanket, dim the lights, and get comfortable. This isn't just a history lesson, it's a bedtime story about how the world got deceived by a miracle in a bottle. Imagine waking up in the 1800s. No alarm clocks, no scrolling through your phone, just roosters crowing and the smell of wood smoke drifting through the morning air. You stretch, maybe crack your back a little, and then it hits you. You've got a toothache. The bad kind. The kind that throbs all the way up to your brain. You call for a doctor, but guess what? There's no anesthesia, no antibiotics, no painkillers. The doctor shows up with a rusty pair of pliers, pours you a glass of whiskey, and says, "This might sting a bit." Yeah, life back then hurt. A lot. If you broke your leg, it got sawed off. If you got sick, people blamed bad air, or maybe your mood. Surgery was basically a test of how loud you could scream before fainting. Infection was a death sentence, and every day was a gamble between surviving or becoming another cautionary tale. The world was booming, factories, trains, cities filled with noise and smoke, but medicine was still living in the dark ages. People coughed, bled, and limped through life with very little relief. And through all that misery, humanity kept searching for something, anything, to make the pain stop. And that's where opium came in. It wasn't new. Ancient civilizations had been using it for thousands of years, but in the 1800s, it became the superstar of medicine. A few drops of the stuff and your pain melted away. Coughing stopped. Sleepless nights vanished. It was the miracle in a bottle everyone had been waiting for. You could buy it at your local pharmacy, no prescription needed. Opium came in powders, tonics, teas, and even children's medicine. Yes, people were giving opium to babies. One of the most popular remedies was called Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup. It was supposed to calm fussy infants, and it did, because it was basically sweetened opium in a pretty bottle. Adults loved it too. Poets sipped laudanum to find inspiration. Painters used it to escape their demons. Housewives took it for headaches, nerves, and stress. Even doctors swore by it. Everyone had their little bottle tucked away somewhere. Opium didn't discriminate, rich, poor, sick, or healthy. It promised comfort to all. But beneath all that comfort, something darker was brewing. People started noticing that when they stopped taking opium, things got bad. Sweating, shaking, pain worse than before, and this strange, desperate craving for another dose. Addiction wasn't really a word people used yet, so doctors called it opium habit, or blamed the patient for being weak. No one wanted to believe that their miracle medicine could also be a monster. The truth was, people were becoming dependent on what was supposed to heal them. In London, Paris, and New York, opium dens began to appear, hidden in back alleys and basements. The middle-class housewife with her soothing syrup wasn't so different from the man slumped in an opium den, both chasing the same relief. And sometimes, the doctors treating them were secretly hooked themselves. Imagine that, your physician telling you to rest and take another dose, while he's sneaking his own sip between appointments. But science was moving fast, and chemists were determined to fix the problem. If opium caused addiction, maybe they could extract just the good part and leave the bad behind. That's what one young German pharmacist, Friedrich Serturner, set out to do in 1804. After years of experimenting, he finally managed to pull a pure white powder from the sticky opium resin. It was powerful. A tiny amount could erase pain completely. Serturner called it morphine, after Morpheus, the Greek god of dreams. And honestly, the name couldn't have been more perfect. He tested it on himself and his friends, because apparently that's what counted as medical research back then. The results were amazing. Pain gone. Sleep came easily. Dreams were vivid and pleasant. Serturner believed he discovered the future of medicine, a cleaner, safer version of opium. Doctors cheered. Pharmacies stocked up. Morphine became the new golden child of medicine. But the celebration didn't last long. Morphine was just as addictive, maybe even more so. The problem really exploded during the American Civil War. Surgeons used morphine on everything: amputations, bullet wounds, shattered bones, infections. It was a godsend on the battlefield, but when soldiers came home, many couldn't stop taking it. They suffered withdrawals so severe that newspapers gave it a name: the soldier's disease. The cure for pain had turned into a curse. By the late 1800s, the world was still desperate for relief. Morphine worked, but at a heavy price. People needed something better, a true painkiller without the chains of addiction. Scientists believed they could do it. After all, this was the age of discovery. Electricity lit up cities. Steamships crossed oceans. Why couldn't chemistry finally conquer pain? And that's when a small German company named Bayer entered the story. Inside their laboratories, young chemists began experimenting with morphine molecules, searching for that perfect balance, something strong enough to kill pain but gentle enough to be safe. They were chasing a dream, a medicine that could heal without harm. They didn't know it yet, but they were about to create something far more powerful than they imagined. A drug that would start with hope and end with heartbreak. A drug the world would one day call heroin. The 1800s were a century of progress and pain, of brilliant discoveries and tragic mistakes. Humanity's quest to escape suffering pushed science forward, but also deeper into danger. People wanted relief so badly that they didn't ask the one question that really mattered: at what cost? Imagine a quiet German town in the early 1800s. Cobblestone streets, smoke curling from chimneys, and a small pharmacy tucked between wooden houses. Inside, a young pharmacist named Friedrich Serturner was about to change the world, though he probably had no idea just how much. Serturner was curious. the kind of person who stared at a chemical formula for hours and muttered to himself. He had a question most people ignored: what exactly in opium is doing the work? Opium worked wonders for pain, yes, but it also left people hooked, weak, and miserable. Friedrich wanted to isolate the part that healed without enslaving. Working with glass beakers, powders, and long nights of trial and error, he carefully separated the sticky resin of opium into its chemical components. Finally, after months of painstaking experiments, he extracted a white powder that was stronger than opium, purer, and, as far as he could tell, magical. He called it morphine, after Morpheus, the god of dreams. It felt fitting, because the powder didn't just ease pain, it carried you into calm, deep sleep. Sir Turner tested it on himself and a few trusted friends. They reported relief so profound it was almost like touching another world. Pain that had been constant for days, weeks, or even years simply vanished. Doctors across Germany began to take notice. Morphine was hailed as a miracle, a triumph of science. The drug quickly made its way into hospitals and pharmacies, and for a time, it seemed like the world had finally found the perfect medicine. Surgeries could be performed with less suffering. People recovering from injuries slept through the night. Soldiers wounded in battle felt relief that no whiskey or laudanum could provide. But, of course, every miracle comes with a shadow. Almost immediately, people began to notice the side effects. Morphine was incredibly powerful, too powerful. Those who used it frequently started to crave it. The withdrawal symptoms were harsh: shaking, sweating, nausea, and unbearable pain. People who had sought relief found themselves trapped in a new kind of suffering. During the American Civil War, morphine became widespread. Surgeons, desperate to treat wounded soldiers efficiently, used it liberally. It saved countless lives, but it also created a generation of addicted veterans. They came home in pain, broken and dependent. Newspapers reported stories of former soldiers who couldn't stop taking morphine, and doctors began calling it the soldier's disease. A cure that saved lives on the battlefield had turned into a hidden epidemic. At the same time, Sir Turner's discovery marked the birth of modern pharmacology. Scientists realized that plants contained active principles, compounds that could be extracted, purified, and measured precisely. Medicine was no longer guesswork with messy tinctures and unknown doses. Chemists now had the power to isolate, manipulate, and theoretically improve upon nature. Morphine was just the first of many steps toward a more scientific approach to healing. The story of morphine also highlighted a tricky truth: humans have always sought relief, and they will often pursue it to excess. People didn't understand the neurological grip of morphine. Doctors wrote prescriptions, patients followed instructions, and yet addiction spread quietly. It wasn't moral weakness, it was chemistry. And chemistry was ruthless. By the mid-1800s, morphine was everywhere. It appeared in painkillers, cough syrups, and tonics. Wealthy people kept it in their homes. Soldiers carried it in their pockets. Housewives used it to soothe nerves, and children were given it for fevers and teething. It was a society-wide experiment in dependence, masked as medicine. At the same time, scientists were learning from their mistakes. They realized that understanding the chemical structure of drugs wasn't enough. They needed to consider human behavior, addiction, and dosage. Each experiment brought new insights, new hope, and, inevitably, new disasters. And then came the idea that would eventually lead to heroin. If morphine worked so well but was addictive, maybe chemists could tweak it. Change a molecule here, add an atom there, and presto, a drug that relieved pain without the risks. It seemed almost too good to be true. And in the labs of Germany, in cities like Elberfeld and Berlin, chemists began to experiment. They were motivated by curiosity, ambition, and, yes, a little greed. Medicine could save lives, but it could also make fortunes. Bayer, the company that would eventually create heroin, was already famous for aspirin, and its scientists believed they could solve the morphine problem once and for all. It's important to remember, though, that at this point, nobody had bad intentions. They genuinely wanted to help people. They wanted a drug that wouldn't enslave anyone. They wanted relief for soldiers, mothers, and the sick. They wanted to conquer suffering. But science is messy, and human biology is even messier. Morphine taught the world that even with the best intentions, medicine could create as much harm as good. It was powerful, miraculous, and dangerous, a lesson that the next generation of chemists would either remember or ignore. By the time Sir Turner passed away, morphine had already changed medicine forever. Doctors had learned that the active principles in plants could be isolated, measured, and standardized. Soldiers, factory workers, and housewives had learned a much harsher lesson, that even miracles could come with chains. And so the stage was set. The world was desperate for pain relief. Scientists were determined to improve on morphine. The next chapter of the story would be about hope, innovation, and the creation of a drug that promised everything, and would deliver tragedy. But for now, people were still living with the consequences of Sir Turner's discovery. Pain had been conquered, but dependency had been born. The line between cure and curse had never been thinner. Humanity had learned one truth about medicine that it would forget again and again. The closer you get to a miracle, the sharper the edge of the sword. By the 1890s, Germany had become a hub of scientific discovery. Cities buzzed with industry, labs smelled of chemicals, and companies competed to make the next big breakthrough in medicine. One of these companies was Bayer, already famous for aspirin, a miracle pill that was changing the way people thought about pain. Now, their chemists had set their sights on morphine. Morphine worked wonders, but everyone knew its dark side. Doctors saw patients who couldn't stop taking it, soldiers returning from war addicted, and households where the very medicine meant to heal had become a chain. Bayer wanted a solution. They wanted a painkiller that was strong but safe, potent but non-addictive. It seemed like the perfect challenge for a company at the forefront of chemistry. Inside a quiet laboratory, a young chemist named Felix Hoffmann was hard at work. He had already made a name for himself by helping synthesize aspirin, and now his bosses had given him a new task: take morphine and improve it. This was no small feat. Morphine was a powerful molecule, and any modification could either weaken it or make it more dangerous. But Hoffmann was determined. After careful experiments, mixing and refining, he succeeded. By altering the chemical structure of morphine, he created a new compound, diacetyl morphine. It was stronger, more soluble, and, according to Bayer's claims, non-addictive. They named it heroin, deriving the word from heroish, meaning heroic. The name carried hope, a promise that this new drug could save lives without the risk of dependency that had haunted morphine. Bayer was ecstatic. They tested their new compound in laboratories and on volunteers, and early reports were promising. People experienced rapid pain relief, sedation, and cough suppression. Unlike morphine, it seemed refined, gentle, and modern, a medicine that could fit into the elegant lives of doctors, patients, and even children. Advertisements celebrated its supposed safety, with illustrations of mothers giving doses to smiling children and doctors recommending it freely. The company marketed heroin as a solution to morphine addiction. It was supposed to help people wean off morphine without suffering. It was a miracle medicine that promised all the benefits of morphine but none of the risks. The public was thrilled. Newspapers praised it, pharmacies stocked it, and doctors prescribed it enthusiastically. Yet beneath the confidence, there were questions. Scientists didn't fully understand addiction or the long-term effects of altering morphine, but the world trusted Bayer. Chemistry had always been heroic. If they said it was safe, most people believed it without doubt. Heroin quickly spread beyond pharmacies. It appeared in cough syrups, lozenges, and pain elixirs. Middle-class families used it casually, and physicians recommended it for a variety of ailments. Society saw it as elegant, refined, and almost glamorous. In the late 19th century, this chemical marvel represented progress. It was the pinnacle of human ingenuity, a drug that could supposedly cure pain, calm nerves, and even help addicts. And for a while, it seemed true. Patients reported remarkable relief, and doctors praised its potency. Mothers gave it to their children for coughs and colds. Soldiers used it for pain. Chronic patients received it without hesitation. Bayer's marketing machine painted heroin as a triumph of science, and the public bought the story completely. There was a sense of confidence that only comes from absolute belief in progress. The chemists in their labs believed they had done something heroic. The company believed they were solving a global problem. Doctors believed in their science. And the world, eager for relief from suffering, embraced it wholeheartedly. But history has a way of reminding people that confidence can be fragile. Early reports of dependency were quietly filed away, ignored, or dismissed. Few saw the warning signs. The chemical was so potent that the line between medical use and addiction was thinner than anyone realized. People were lulled by the elegance of the drug, the sophistication of its branding, and the authority of the scientists who created it. The creation of heroin marked a turning point. It was a triumph of chemistry and ingenuity, a moment when science seemed to outpace the very biology it sought to control. But it also set the stage for disaster. The same qualities that made heroin appealing, its strength, purity, and refinement, made it easy to misuse and almost impossible to control once dependence began. In its early days, heroin carried all the hope of a miracle drug. It promised to relieve pain, treat morphine addiction, and soothe the sick. It seemed like a hero, and in some ways, for a brief moment, it was. But history was already whispering a warning. Even the most brilliant invention could have consequences no one predicted. A drug that started as a promise of relief would soon become one of the most notorious substances in the world, affecting millions of lives across generations. For now, though, Bayer celebrated. Chemists like Hoffman were hailed as innovators. The world marveled at the new chemical marvel, and people opened their medicine cabinets with excitement and trust. Pain seemed conquerable. Addiction seemed avoidable. Science seemed heroic. And that is how heroin entered the world, not as a villain, not as a scandal, but as a solution. A shining, heroic solution. A solution that the world would soon learn had a darker side no one expected. The story of heroin's creation is a lesson in ambition, hope, and human desire for quick solutions. It shows how the promise of science can inspire, comfort, and, sometimes, deceive. A heroic name, a confident laboratory, and the trust of the public were all in place. The only thing missing was the understanding that miracles are never without cost. Heroin didn't take long to become a sensation. Bayer's new compound was marketed as a cure-all, a replacement for morphine, and even a treatment for addiction itself. Doctors prescribed it for coughs, colds, and pain. Pharmacists stocked it in their cabinets, and households began to keep small bottles tucked away, just in case someone needed relief. Advertisements showed mothers giving it to their children, smiling and calm. The message was clear. This was medicine you could trust. It was potent but gentle, modern and refined. A spoonful of heroin could make sleepless nights bearable, coughs vanish, and pain disappear. People felt comforted, and they believed in the science behind it. Bayer had created more than a chemical compound, they had created trust. At first, it seemed like a dream come true. Heroin was everywhere. Soldiers used it for injuries. Housewives used it for nerves. Children received it for fevers and coughs. Doctors praised it in journals, calling it pure, safe, and effective. The world marveled at how quickly science had delivered something so remarkable. Yet, beneath the surface, the illusion of control was fragile. The very qualities that made heroin appealing, its strength, its purity, its refinement, also made it risky. People felt safe because it was modern, elegant, and pharmaceutical. They couldn't imagine that something so well packaged could be dangerous. But addiction didn't care about labels, marketing, or confidence. It crept in quietly, often unnoticed until it was too late. Early users experienced remarkable relief. Pain faded, anxiety eased, sleep returned. It felt like magic. Some doctors even recommended heroin to help patients wean off morphine, believing it was the solution to previous epidemics of dependency. It worked in theory. In practice, the new drug was just as powerful, just as seductive. The body didn't see the difference between morphine and diacetylmorphine. Chemistry was chemical, and the brain was oblivious to branding. Families grew accustomed to heroin. It became part of everyday life. A cough syrup in the morning, a small dose for aches in the evening. People trusted the doctors, the pharmacists, and the companies producing it. It seemed sophisticated, almost luxurious. It was medicine that fit the polished, orderly lives that Victorian society prized. But society had learned little from morphine. Addiction was invisible in those days. Doctors believed they could control dosage, patients believed they were safe, and the public believed that science was infallible. And in a world that had suffered through centuries of pain, hope was irresistible. Heroin promised not just relief, but the end of suffering altogether. People wanted to believe. As the drug spread, its reach extended beyond the wealthy. Middle-class families used it for comfort, the infirm for relief, and households stocked it alongside tonics and teas. It was practical, respectable, and entirely legal. The world had never seen a substance so seamlessly woven into daily life, so openly accepted by society. It was, for all appearances, perfect. But perfection is often deceptive. The very people using heroin began to show the earliest signs of dependence. Some noticed they needed larger doses to achieve the same effect. Others experienced irritability or restlessness if they missed a dose. Doctors wrote a few reports, but they were drowned out by the overwhelming praise in journals and advertisements. The miracle looked flawless, and nobody wanted to admit otherwise. The story of heroin in these early years is a cautionary tale in patience and observation. The drug seemed controlled, predictable, and safe. Families and doctors alike were lulled by the elegance of the packaging, the confidence of the scientists, and the authority of the company behind it. Yet the seeds of addiction were already planted, hidden behind the illusion of safety. By the early 1900s, heroin had become a staple in medicine cabinets, pharmacies, and households across Europe and beyond. It was a new kind of medicine, potent, refined, and seemingly free from the failures of its predecessors. Bayer's creation embodied hope. It carried the promise of a world where pain could be eliminated without consequence. But human biology is rarely so accommodating. The very potency that made heroin effective also made it dangerous. Its ability to produce relief so rapidly meant that the brain began to rely on it. Users were often unaware of the growing dependence until it became a problem. Families noticed subtle changes: anxiety when doses were delayed, irritability, or subtle cravings. By the time addiction became visible, it was already deep. Still, in the public eye, heroin remained a hero. Doctors continued to prescribe it, journals continued to praise it, and advertisements continued to assure the world that it was safe. People had faith in the drug, in medicine, and in progress itself. The illusion of control was nearly complete. Heroin's story in these years shows how easily hope and science can intersect, for better or worse. It demonstrates that even the most carefully engineered solutions can carry hidden consequences. It reminds us that human desire for relief is powerful, relentless, and sometimes blind to the risks. By the end of its first decade, heroin had established itself as a fixture of medical practice, domestic life, and cultural trust. It had earned its reputation as a miracle medicine. And yet, lurking beneath the surface, addiction waited patiently, ready to emerge and remind the world that no miracle comes without cost. The early spread of heroin also set the stage for larger societal challenges. Dependency wasn't limited to individuals. It would ripple outward, affecting families, communities, and eventually nations. The consequences of these first years of widespread use would echo for decades, shaping the way people thought about medicine, addiction, and the fine line between cure and curse. In its earliest days, heroin was celebrated as a triumph of science. It embodied the hope of a world free from pain, the confidence of chemists, and the trust of the public. Yet it also carried the seeds of tragedy, quietly, invisibly, and in ways few could predict. The miracle was real, but so was the danger, and the two were intertwined more tightly than anyone could have imagined. For the people living in this era, heroin felt like relief, elegance, and modernity wrapped in a small glass bottle. But in the decades to come, it would prove that miracles are rarely simple, and that even the most promising solutions can have consequences that reach far beyond their creator's intentions. The early praise for heroin didn't last forever. Slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, reports started to surface about people who couldn't control their use. Patients who had started with a simple cough syrup or a pain elixir found themselves needing more and more just to feel normal. Families noticed subtle changes. A mother seemed more irritable, a soldier returned home anxious and restless, a worker needed a little extra each night. Doctors were surprised. How could a medicine, created in the name of science and progress, cause harm? It didn't fit the story they had been told. Heroin was supposed to be the safer alternative to morphine, the miracle cure. Yet, there it was. Dependence, quietly spreading among ordinary people. Some physicians began to whisper warnings in medical journals. Patients who had taken the drug for legitimate reasons were now hooked. The addiction was faster and more intense than morphine. Those who used morphine often took it for years before becoming dependent. Heroin created a problem in weeks. Still, many doctors refused to believe it. Science, after all, was supposed to be reliable. Newspapers began to pick up the stories. Headlines hinted at mysterious illnesses, unexplained symptoms, and even overdoses. Yet, even as these reports spread, society had already embraced heroin too deeply to see it as dangerous. Pharmacies still stocked it, doctors still prescribed it, and households still gave it to children. The illusion of safety was strong. People addicted to heroin often started their journeys innocently. A soldier returned from war with lingering pain, a mother reached for a syrup to soothe a persistent cough, a patient sought relief from chronic illness. They had no idea that the same chemical bringing comfort could also create dependency. The descent was subtle at first. Missing a dose caused restlessness, anxiety, or minor irritability. Then came stronger cravings. People found themselves calculating doses, timing medicine intake, and adjusting schedules to ensure they could get their next relief. It wasn't just physical, it was mental. Heroin took hold in the brain in ways that were invisible but relentless. Bayer's confident claims of safety seemed to shield the world from reality. The company had marketed heroin as non-addictive, and for a while, that claim convinced doctors, patients, and families. But behind the polished advertisements and reassuring labels, the chemical didn't follow the rules humans expected. Dependence was happening everywhere, but society was unprepared to recognize it. The earliest addicts were ordinary people. Soldiers, housewives, shopkeepers, and even physicians themselves began to feel the grip of the drug. Some hid it carefully, maintaining their jobs and families, while others struggled openly. The shame and secrecy were part of the culture. Addiction wasn't talked about. People feared judgment more than illness. At the same time, medical professionals were at a crossroads. Some recognized the problem, raising alarms in journals and conferences. Others dismissed it, believing that careful prescription and dosage could prevent harm. It was a period of confusion, disbelief, and slow awakening. Science had promised safety, yet human experience suggested otherwise. Heroin's spread revealed another challenge. Addiction didn't respect boundaries. It affected people of all classes, all professions, all ages. The drug didn't discriminate. What started as a miracle for a few quickly became a common thread linking diverse populations. Communities that had celebrated scientific progress now faced a hidden crisis. Pharmacists noticed patterns. Repeat customers, larger doses, more frequent visits. Some quietly raised concerns. Others continued business as usual, assuming that the benefits outweighed the risks. In homes, families struggled to understand why a loved one seemed changed. Anxiety, irritability, and cravings were often interpreted as moral failings rather than chemical reactions. The confusion deepened as heroin was still considered a modern, elegant medicine. Its refined image, clean bottles, precise doses, and scientific branding gave users and doctors a false sense of control. People trusted it because it was scientific, forgetting that biology doesn't follow labels or advertisements. Even as early signs of dependency appeared, heroin's popularity continued. It was effective, quick-acting, and socially acceptable. Children were still given cough syrups, mothers took it for stress, and doctors prescribed it for pain. The world was caught between admiration and alarm, between progress and caution. By the time the first serious reports of widespread addiction appeared, it was already too late to ignore the problem. The early 1900s saw a quiet rise in heroin dependency, but most people still believed in its safety. The illusion of control was strong, and the world's trust in science had not yet faltered. Yet for those living through it, the impact was real. Families were affected. Workplaces struggled. Soldiers returned from battle physically healed but chemically dependent. Ordinary lives began to fracture under the subtle weight of the drug. It wasn't just a medical problem, it was a social one. Heroin's unraveling didn't happen in dramatic headlines at first. It was gradual, creeping into homes, hospitals, and pharmacies. Addiction spread quietly, patiently, often invisible to anyone who wasn't directly affected. That made it more dangerous. People believed they were in control until the moment they weren't. The world had a choice: continue trusting in the miracle, or start questioning the limits of science. Many chose trust. Doctors continued prescribing, families continued using, and companies continued selling. Behind every success story was a hidden tragedy, subtle but growing. By the end of this period, heroin had become more than a medicine. It was a social force, a chemical shadow in everyday life. People were addicted without realizing it. Some were desperate, some in denial, some quietly suffering. The very drug that promised relief now demanded obedience. History was starting to show a pattern. The closer a substance comes to perfection, the greater its risk. Heroin's early promise had masked its danger, and society was only beginning to wake up to the consequences. Doctors, patients, and families alike would learn that no medicine, no matter how modern or elegant, is entirely free from cost. The unraveling had begun, and the consequences would ripple outward for decades. Heroin was no longer just a miracle. It was a warning. It was a lesson in trust, in science, and in the fragile line between relief and dependency. And that quiet, creeping tension between hope and harm, trust and risk, would define the next chapter of the drug's history. By the early 1900s, heroin was quietly weaving itself into everyday life. People who started using it for legitimate reasons, pain, coughs, sleepless nights, often found themselves trapped in a cycle they didn't understand. It wasn't just soldiers or factory workers. It was everyone: housewives, shopkeepers, even doctors who thought they were administering a harmless remedy. The epidemic of addiction wasn't always visible. It didn't announce itself with flashing signs or dramatic collapse. Instead, it crept into homes, subtly changing people's moods, energy, and priorities. A mother who once calmly prepared breakfast might become irritable or restless when she missed a dose. A soldier returning from war could be shaking and anxious even after surviving the battlefield. Addiction was personal, quiet, and shameful. People didn't talk about it openly. Society wasn't ready to confront the idea that dependence could happen to ordinary, respectable people. There was stigma, guilt, and fear. Many tried to hide their struggles, keeping the secret locked behind smiles, polite manners, and carefully measured doses. The addict wasn't a criminal or a derelict. Often, it was the neighbor next door, the friendly shopkeeper, or the doctor who smiled while writing another prescription. Heroin wasn't like the old opium problem. Opium had a cultural image: exotic, mysterious, sometimes romanticized in dens or artistic circles. Heroin was faster, cleaner, and more intense. People fell deeper, more quickly, and with fewer warning signs. Where opium might take months or years to ensnare someone, heroin could do it in weeks. That made it far more dangerous, and far more invisible to the people who loved them. Families struggled to understand what was happening. Children would notice subtle changes in their parents, a sudden irritability, secretive behavior, or unexplained absences. Husbands and wives watched one another withdraw into the comfort of the drug, unsure whether it was illness, stress, or something else entirely. Heroin's power was as psychological as it was chemical. It rewired the brain in ways that were invisible but undeniable. Even physicians weren't immune. Many prescribed heroin in good faith, unaware that some of their patients, or even themselves, were becoming dependent. Doctors believed in the science, trusted the laboratories, and relied on the assurances of companies like Bayer. It was a golden era of chemical confidence. And yet, the very people trusted to heal were often the ones struggling quietly, caught in the same cycle as their patients. The addict next door could be anyone. Soldiers returning from battle with lingering pain were among the first wave. They had survived war, bullets, and amputations, only to face a new battlefield inside their own bodies. Housewives, trying to cope with stress, fatigue, and domestic responsibilities, reached for syrups and tonics. Even children, given doses for coughs and fevers, were unknowingly introduced to dependency. It was democratic in its reach, affecting rich and poor, urban and rural, educated and uneducated. The secrecy made the problem worse. People were ashamed. Families tried to hide the signs. Doctors struggled to diagnose a condition that wasn't fully understood. Addiction wasn't recognized as a medical problem yet. It was often seen as moral weakness or poor judgment. That made recovery nearly impossible for those affected. People were trapped in a cycle of dependence and shame, a double burden that few could bear alone. Newspapers began to report cases of heroin dependency, but the stories were sporadic, sensationalized, and often ignored. Headlines focused on tragic extremes, overdoses, public scandals, and criminal cases. The subtle, pervasive impact, the slow, invisible grip of addiction on ordinary people, went largely unnoticed. Society was only beginning to recognize the scale of the problem. The drug's influence was also cultural. Where opium had been exotic, heroin became modern. It was pharmaceutical, clean, and scientifically validated. That made it easier to trust, harder to question, and more widely accepted. People didn't see themselves as addicts. They saw themselves as responsible users, taking a medicine prescribed by professionals. The illusion of control was almost complete. But the illusion was just that. The addict next door wasn't always obvious, but the signs were there. Small changes in routine, subtle irritability, a growing reliance on daily doses. Heroin didn't discriminate, and it didn't care about social status, gender, or morality. It simply rewired the brain, creating cravings and dependence that could escalate rapidly if unnoticed. By the 1910s, the first whispers of a global problem were beginning to circulate. Heroin wasn't just a medical tool anymore, it was a social phenomenon. Doctors, families, and communities had begun to see patterns. Addiction was no longer rare, and no one was completely immune. The world was slowly realizing that a miracle drug could have disastrous consequences, even in the most ordinary of lives. This quiet, creeping epidemic marked a turning point. The addict next door was no longer an exception or an outcast. They were representative of a growing trend, the normalization of dependence in everyday life. Families, doctors, and communities were forced to confront a reality that science and marketing had promised would not exist. At the same time, society was slow to react. There was little understanding of treatment or recovery. Addiction was a secret shame, hidden behind polite manners, home remedies, and continued use of the drug. The consequences would continue to ripple outward, affecting relationships, work, and health. The first signs of social and cultural disruption were appearing, even as most people remained unaware. Heroin's early years show how easily a substance can move from medicine to epidemic. It demonstrates the power of trust, the danger of blind faith in progress, and the human desire for relief that sometimes outweighs caution. Ordinary people, taking what they believed was safe medicine, were unknowingly caught in a chemical trap. By the end of this period, the addict next door was everywhere. Some were hidden behind closed doors, quietly struggling. Others were visible, their dependency apparent to anyone who looked closely. Heroin had moved beyond the laboratory, beyond pharmacy counters, and into the fabric of daily life. Its impact was personal, pervasive, and, for many, devastating. The story of the addict next door is a reminder that crises don't always arrive loudly. They creep in slowly, quietly, invisibly, affecting ordinary lives in profound ways. Heroin had promised relief, modernity, and safety. Instead, it had introduced dependence, secrecy, and shame. And yet, for those caught in its grip, it was still a source of comfort, however fleeting. The quiet epidemic was only beginning. Families, doctors, and society at large would soon have to confront the scale of the problem. The addict next door was not just a single person. They were a symbol of a hidden, growing crisis that would shape the 20th century. By the early 1910s, it was becoming harder to ignore what heroin had done. The miracle medicine, once praised in journals and trusted in homes, was showing its dark side. Dependence and addiction weren't just whispers anymore, they were quietly shaping society. Doctors started to worry, families noticed changes, and newspapers began to cover cases of abuse and overdose. The conversation had shifted. What had once been celebrated as progress now carried a shadow. Governments began to take notice. In the United States, the Harrison Narcotics Tax Act of 1914 marked the first serious attempt to control opiates, including heroin. The law wasn't about punishment at first, it was about regulation, taxation, and tracking distribution. Prescriptions had to be recorded, and certain uses required strict reporting. It was a step toward acknowledging that medicine alone couldn't solve the problem, and that society needed some control over drugs that had once been trusted blindly. Internationally, concern was growing as well. Conferences were held to discuss opiate trade, use, and regulation. Governments around the world were slowly realizing that these substances weren't just local issues, they were global challenges. The conversations were cautious at first. Many countries still trusted pharmaceutical companies and doctors, but the signs of dependency and misuse were becoming harder to ignore. Bayer, meanwhile, quietly discontinued the heroin trademark by 1913. The company didn't broadcast this fact. Heroin had been a scientific triumph and a commercial success, but the growing evidence of dependency and misuse made it politically and socially risky. By removing the trademark, Bayer attempted to distance itself from the emerging controversy, while the substance itself remained on pharmacy shelves, still available under generic labels. The transition from pharmacy counters to street corners had begun, though few realized it at the time. Heroin was slowly moving from a medical marvel into a substance that people might use outside the oversight of doctors. The beginnings of an illegal market were forming, fueled by the gap between public demand and controlled distribution. People who had become dependent were now seeking ways to obtain the drug, whether legally or not. Public perception was shifting too. Families who had once trusted heroin as a cure now whispered about addiction, secrecy, and shame. Communities began to notice patterns of behavior that were alarming but difficult to confront openly. Children, housewives, and soldiers, all who had once been seen as beneficiaries of medicine, were now quietly part of a broader social problem. Despite all this, the science behind heroin was still impressive. It worked. It relieved pain. It soothed coughs and calmed nerves. And for many, it remained a source of relief, even as dependency grew. That duality, the miracle and the danger, made the crisis confusing. People didn't know whether to celebrate the drug's efficacy or fear its consequences. Newspapers began to report on overdoses and the social consequences of addiction, though often with sensationalism rather than understanding. The language used reflected society's discomfort. Heroinism, drug habit, and other vague terms masked the reality of chemical dependence. Families were reluctant to discuss it, doctors were uncertain how to respond, and the public relied on a combination of trust and ignorance. The early 20th century marked a turning point. Heroin was no longer simply a pharmaceutical experiment. It was a societal issue, a public health concern, and an early example of how medicine, commerce, and human desire could collide with unforeseen consequences. People were learning, sometimes painfully, that science alone couldn't solve the human craving for relief. Meanwhile, those addicted were often caught between two worlds. They had started with a legitimate medical need, or with the trust society placed in modern medicine. Now, they were forced to navigate a changing landscape of regulation, social stigma, and personal dependency. The legal measures introduced were only partially effective. The gap between law, medicine, and real-world use created space for people to fall through. The fall of heroin as a miracle wasn't dramatic at first. There wasn't a single moment of collapse. Instead, it was a quiet erosion of trust, a slow unraveling of the belief that chemistry could conquer pain without consequence. Families, doctors, and governments were learning, often too late, that what seemed safe could become dangerous in the hands of ordinary people. Heroin's story at this point highlights a recurring pattern in human history: the tension between innovation and unintended consequences. Society had embraced a miracle without fully understanding it. Chemical knowledge had outpaced social awareness, creating a gap that would take decades to bridge. The results were complex, messy, and deeply human. By the end of this period, heroin had become a complicated symbol. It represented human ingenuity, scientific progress, and the promise of relief. At the same time, it symbolized dependency, social disruption, and the hidden costs of innovation. The drug had moved from laboratory to pharmacy, and from there to the streets, foreshadowing the global challenges that lay ahead. Early regulations, like the Heroin Act, were imperfect but important. They acknowledged that medicine alone couldn't guarantee safety. They marked a societal recognition that human biology, desire, and social behavior needed to be considered alongside chemical innovation. For the first time, the law began to intervene, laying the groundwork for a more controlled, if still imperfect, approach to dangerous substances. Heroin's journey from a celebrated medicine to a regulated substance reflects the slow, often painful process of learning from mistakes. It's a story of hope, trust, and unintended consequences. Society had celebrated science, welcomed the miracle, and only gradually began to realize the hidden costs. By the time Bayer stepped back and regulations started to appear, the world had already glimpsed the challenges that heroin would continue to pose. Families struggled in private, doctors wrestled with uncertainty, and governments began the long, difficult task of understanding and controlling a substance that was more powerful than anyone had imagined. The fall of heroin as a cure wasn't the end of the story. It was just the beginning of a new chapter, one that would see the drug move from legal medicine to underground networks, from pharmacy counters to street corners. The seeds of a global epidemic were quietly being sown, while society adjusted, slowly and unevenly, to the reality that miracles sometimes carry hidden consequences. Heroin had once been celebrated as science's triumph, a solution to pain and addiction. Now it was a cautionary tale, a reminder that even the most promising inventions can have unforeseen effects. And as the world would soon discover, the journey from miracle to menace was only just beginning. After heroin slipped off pharmacy shelves and regulations began to tighten, the drug didn't disappear. It went underground. In the 1920s and 1930s, the substance that had once been celebrated as a miracle became part of a shadowy, hidden world. Users were no longer patients with prescriptions. They were people quietly seeking relief, escape, or pleasure outside the gaze of doctors and regulators. The Jazz Age added an unexpected dimension. Speakeasies, clubs, and late-night lounges were filled with music, smoke, and a sense of rebellion. Heroin became part of the scene for some artists, musicians, and bohemians. It wasn't just a drug, it was a symbol, a quiet act of defiance, and sometimes a misguided source of inspiration. The allure of forbidden substances had a romantic image, even as its grip tightened on individuals' lives. Prohibition in the United States inadvertently fueled the problem. Criminal networks, already set up to smuggle alcohol, found new opportunities in narcotics. Heroin, along with other opiates, started moving along hidden routes. Organized crime became involved, seeing both profit and power in a substance that people needed and couldn't always resist. Cities like New York and Chicago became early epicenters for underground distribution. The drug wasn't limited to the U.S. Europe faced its own challenges. France, Italy, and other countries struggled with smuggling, local production, and the social consequences of addiction. Ports, shipping lanes, and trade networks created opportunities for substances to move across borders. Heroin was no longer a medicine you could buy at a pharmacy. It had become part of a larger, global story, one that governments were only beginning to notice. Despite the underground nature of the drug, users often tried to maintain normal lives. Workers held jobs, families went about routines, and addicts hid their dependence with a mix of pride and fear. The secrecy was part of the social dynamic. Addiction carried shame, and people learned to navigate it quietly. This invisibility made the problem even harder for authorities and society to address. The League of Nations began making tentative efforts to control the trade in opiates. Conferences were held, treaties discussed, and limited regulations put in place. But global demand continued to rise. Where governments tried to restrict use, black markets filled the gap. Heroin had become a product that could not be entirely stopped. It simply adapted to new rules and circumstances. Routes for the drug expanded internationally. The Golden Triangle in Southeast Asia, with its opium fields and complex networks, became increasingly important. Heroin found its way from these remote regions to major cities around the world. Marseille in France, New York in the U.S., and other port cities became key distribution points. It was a web of commerce, secrecy, and dependence that had no single controlling authority. Addiction patterns shifted as well. The new heroin users were often different from the early 1900s patients. They included artists, urban workers, and young people curious about the allure of the substance. The speed and intensity of dependence remained, and withdrawal could still be brutal. Yet society remained fascinated, fearful, and often dismissive of the underlying problem. The cultural image of heroin, also evolved. From a miracle medicine, it became a symbol of modernity's hidden costs, a glamorous yet dangerous presence in underground scenes. Writers, musicians, and performers sometimes romanticized use, portraying the drug as a companion to creativity and nightlife. But beneath the surface, dependency continued to spread quietly, leaving families and communities struggling to understand its consequences. Medical professionals were caught in a bind. On one hand, heroin's legitimate medical uses remained. On the other, the growing illegal use and stories of addiction challenged their authority. Reports from Europe and America showed that the drug's reach was no longer just a medical concern, it was a social one. Professionals were beginning to realize that chemistry alone could not predict human behavior. The combination of legal restriction, social fascination, and underground distribution created a unique environment. Heroin became simultaneously taboo and intriguing. Its presence in artistic and urban subcultures gave it mystique, while its addictive power created hidden tragedies. Society struggled to balance fascination with fear, curiosity with caution. Meanwhile, the infrastructure for trafficking and smuggling was improving. Organized crime had learned lessons from alcohol prohibition, applying them to narcotics. Routes, networks, and covert operations allowed the drug to move efficiently, meeting the persistent global demand. Heroin was no longer simply a chemical compound, it was a commodity, a social force, and a growing challenge for authorities. By the end of the interwar period, the stage was set for the next chapter. Heroin was firmly established as a global phenomenon. It had moved from pharmacy counters to secret networks, from medicinal use to cultural symbol, from occasional dependence to a widespread social issue. Governments, doctors, and families were all learning, slowly and often painfully, how to cope with its presence. The period between the wars shows how substances adapt to society's rules, gaps, and desires. Heroin survived regulation, prohibition, and stigma because people needed it, sought it, or desired it. Its evolution from medicine to underground commodity was a lesson in unintended consequences. For those affected, life was a delicate balancing act. Users managed dependence quietly, navigating social stigma and secrecy. Families wrestled with fear, shame, and confusion. Doctors faced the dual challenge of managing legitimate medical use while acknowledging growing misuse. And the world, fascinated by modernity and progress, still struggled to see the full scale of the problem. Heroin had become more than a drug. It was a mirror, reflecting society's hopes, fears, and contradictions. It showed the limits of control, the power of desire, and the ways human behavior intersects with chemistry. The stage was set for the next phase of the story: global trafficking, organized crime, and the post-war explosion that would define heroin for generations. And so, between the wars, heroin quietly thrived, shaping lives in ways few could fully understand, setting the world up for a future where a miracle medicine would be remembered as a hidden, enduring danger. After World War II, the world was rebuilding. Cities lay in ruins, economies struggled to recover, and millions of people were trying to find their place in a changed world. In the midst of this recovery, heroin quietly found new pathways. The underground networks that had existed between the wars grew stronger, more organized, and more international. What had once been a local problem became a global one. The French Connection emerged during this time, a name that would go down in history. Heroin produced in the poppy fields of Turkey and the Middle East was processed in labs around Marseille and shipped to cities across Europe and North America. Organized crime had learned lessons from earlier prohibition, creating sophisticated routes and operations. The post-war chaos provided perfect conditions: weak enforcement, high demand, and networks that could adapt quickly. Addiction patterns also shifted. Returning soldiers, exposed to heroin during wartime, brought it home with them. The experience of war left many physically wounded and psychologically scarred, and the drug offered both relief and escape. Families, communities, and medical professionals struggled to understand what was happening. The war had ended, but the battles for individual lives were just beginning. The American cityscape was changing. Heroin use became visible in inner cities, where economic opportunities were limited and social structures were under strain. Addiction became associated with poverty, crime, and urban decay. Yet the reality was more complex. Heroin affected people from all walks of life, from soldiers and factory workers to students and artists. The stereotype of the addict masked a broader, more pervasive social issue. Cold War politics added another layer. Intelligence agencies became aware of opium production in Asia and the Middle East, and covert operations sometimes intersected with trafficking networks. The substance that had begun as a pharmaceutical miracle was now entwined with global politics, crime, and economics. Governments faced a problem that was no longer just medical, it was geopolitical. The French Connection, in particular, became legendary. Heroin from Turkey and the Middle East was refined in Marseille, then shipped to New York, Chicago, and other American cities. Organized crime families orchestrated the trade with precision, ensuring a steady supply and creating new patterns of addiction. For users, the drug was both familiar and dangerous, a chemical that had once been a household medicine now delivered by clandestine networks. Medical understanding lagged behind social reality. Doctors still prescribed opioids for legitimate pain, while illicit use spread in parallel. Communities struggled to respond. Families faced the challenges of hidden addiction, withdrawal, and social stigma. Public awareness was limited, and the first attempts at organized treatment programs were in their infancy. Heroin's dual identity, as medicine and as a street drug, complicated every response. At the same time, cultural perceptions were evolving. Heroin was no longer a refined, pharmaceutical marvel. It was associated with crime, secrecy, and moral panic. Yet there remained a strange allure, a mystique inherited from its earlier days as a miracle drug. The combination of danger and fascination contributed to its persistence, as people continued to seek it despite social disapproval and legal risk. The rise of syndicates marked a turning point in the global heroin trade. Where previously supply had been relatively local, networks now spanned continents. Production, refinement, and distribution became professionalized, almost industrial. Heroin was no longer just a substance, it was a commodity, an economic force with power to influence communities, governments, and international relations. Families and communities felt the impact intimately. Addiction tore at relationships, disrupted work, and created cycles of dependency that were difficult to break. Soldiers returning from war struggled to integrate back into society while battling the chemical bonds of the drug. Mothers and fathers faced shame and confusion, often hiding their own or their children's use. Heroin's consequences were now deeply woven into everyday life. In response, law enforcement began to recognize the need for coordinated action. Yet the scale of the problem was staggering. Syndicates had money, mobility, and networks that governments struggled to track. Heroin was small, easy to transport, and highly profitable, making it an ideal commodity for criminal enterprises. The very qualities that made it effective as a medicine, potency, solubility, and reliability, made it equally valuable as an illicit product. By the 1950s and 1960s, American cities were experiencing the first waves of urban heroin epidemics. Communities saw rising rates of addiction, overdoses, and social disruption. The problem was visible but poorly understood. Families were desperate for solutions, doctors were limited in their tools, and governments were still grappling with regulation and enforcement. Heroin had transitioned fully from miracle medicine to social challenge. Despite this, the drug maintained a subtle cultural presence. Artists, writers, and musicians sometimes romanticized its use, recalling the jazz-era mystique and the sense of rebellion it carried. Yet the reality for most users was harsh, private, and destructive. Dependency was isolating, expensive, and dangerous. The romantic image masked the suffering underneath, a pattern that would repeat in future decades. The post-war period also revealed a simple truth: heroin adapts. It thrived in legal gray zones, in chaotic environments, and wherever demand existed. Efforts to control it through regulation, prohibition, or enforcement were only partially effective. The chemical remained the same, but society had changed, creating new opportunities for its spread. Heroin's history at this stage is a story of contrast. It is the story of recovery after war and the rise of criminal networks. It is a story of science, addiction, and human resilience. It is a story of ordinary people caught between the promise of relief and the consequences of dependency. The drug that had once been celebrated as a miracle had become both a symbol of progress and a warning of human vulnerability. By the end of this period, heroin was firmly established as a global phenomenon. It had moved from households and pharmacies to clandestine labs, shipping routes, and city streets. Addiction was widespread, communities were affected, and syndicates were thriving. The stage was set for the next chapter: the cultural explosion of the 1960s, the Vietnam War, and the domestic crises that would redefine heroin's role in society. And so, heroin continued its journey, silently shaping lives, influencing societies, and proving that a substance once hailed as a miracle could become one of the most enduring challenges of the modern world. The 1960s arrived, and the world seemed to be changing faster than ever. Music, art, and youth culture were exploding with creativity and rebellion. And somewhere in the middle of it all, heroin quietly wove itself into the mix. It wasn't just a medicine anymore, it was part of the counterculture, a symbol of escape, rebellion, and experimentation. Vietnam brought a new chapter in the story. Soldiers stationed in Southeast Asia were exposed to cheap, high-purity heroin. For many, it was a way to cope with the stress, trauma, and boredom of war. It didn't take long for addiction to take hold. When soldiers returned home, they brought the drug with them, along with habits that would ripple through American cities. Families and communities were often unprepared for what was waiting for them. Back home, heroin began appearing in urban neighborhoods, college campuses, and artistic circles. It was paradoxically both hidden and visible. People knew it was there, sometimes glamorized in stories or songs, but the real dangers were still poorly understood. The drug maintained its quiet, seductive grip, easy to use, potent and chemical, yet elusive and secretive. Cultural icons sometimes played a tragic role in shaping the public perception of heroin. Musicians, actors, and writers who struggled with dependency became symbols of rebellion, creativity, and excess. The dark glamour of the drug world made it seem alluring, even as it destroyed lives. Addiction became intertwined with identity, artistic expression, and the search for meaning in a chaotic world. For returning soldiers, the transition back to civilian life was fraught. Many struggled with physical and emotional wounds, compounded by dependence on a substance that had once been a temporary escape. Ordinary routines, jobs, and family life suddenly felt impossible to manage without the drug. Communities watched, often helpless, as the cycle of addiction spread. Government officials began to panic. The rise of heroin in the 1960s became more visible, and public concern grew. Nixon famously declared a war on drugs, signaling a new era in which addiction would be treated as a social threat as well as a personal one. But for many users, this was too little, too late. Addiction had already taken root, quietly reshaping lives across the country. Meanwhile, heroin's chemical reality hadn't changed. Its potency, purity, and addictive qualities remained constant. What changed was the social environment. Youth rebellion, war, urban migration, and cultural experimentation created fertile ground for dependency. People often underestimated the speed at which heroin could take hold, assuming they could control a substance that had long ago proven otherwise. The counterculture also blurred the lines between experimentation and addiction. Psychedelics, marijuana, and other substances were often celebrated for their mind-expanding properties. Heroin was different. It provided relief, escape, and a sense of calm that could be dangerously seductive. People who experimented often found themselves caught in a chemical loop that was hard to break, even as they celebrated other forms of exploration. Families and friends struggled to understand what was happening. Dependency was often secretive, shameful, and isolating. Those addicted were rarely villains or failures. They were ordinary people navigating extraordinary circumstances. Some were artists chasing inspiration, others were students seeking relief from stress, and many were veterans trying to survive post-war life. Heroin didn't discriminate, it simply worked on anyone who used it. Medical understanding was limited. Doctors still treated pain and illness with opioids, but the growing street use of heroin complicated perceptions. Communities were caught between fear, fascination, and misinformation. The very qualities that had made heroin a miracle in the early 1900s, potency, purity, reliability, made it a formidable challenge when used outside controlled environments. By the late 1960s and early 1970s, the social consequences were becoming more visible. Urban neighborhoods experienced rising rates of addiction, crime, and health crises. Families were torn apart, and social services struggled to respond. The chemical that had once soothed coughs and eased pain was now reshaping communities in ways no one had anticipated. Yet, even as the crisis deepened, heroin maintained a certain mystique. Its history as a medicine, its chemical elegance, and its association with rebellion gave it a strange dual identity. Dangerous, yet alluring, destructive, yet fascinating. This tension would continue to define its role in society for decades to come. The counterculture also taught the world something crucial about addiction. It is not always visible, and it is not always confined to the expected places. Wealth, status, and creativity offered no protection. The same substance that had quietly ensnared housewives and soldiers decades earlier now affected a generation of artists, students, and veterans. Dependency had become a social as well as a chemical reality. Government responses were evolving too, but often too slowly. Policies focused on punishment rather than treatment, leaving many addicted individuals without effective support. Law enforcement efforts were fragmented, education campaigns limited, and medical interventions underdeveloped. The result was a growing population of users navigating both chemical dependence and societal neglect. Heroin's journey during this period highlights the interplay of culture, chemistry, and society. It shows how a substance once hailed as a medical marvel can become a symbol of rebellion, a tool for escape, and a cause of social disruption. Its dual identity, miracle and menace, was never more apparent than in this era of cultural experimentation. By the mid-1970s, the lessons were clear. Heroin wasn't just a medical or criminal problem. It was a cultural one, a societal challenge, and a deeply personal struggle for those caught in its grip. Families, doctors, and communities were all learning to navigate its consequences, often with difficulty, and often too late to prevent harm. And so, as the counterculture raged, as music and art defined a generation, heroin quietly threaded through the world. It offered relief, escape, and a dangerous allure, shaping lives in hidden, profound ways. The stage was set for the next chapter: the official war on drugs, mass incarceration, and the rise of cartels that would transform the global landscape of addiction forever. By the 1970s, heroin had become more than a counterculture problem. It was a full-blown societal issue. Cities were seeing rising numbers of addicts, overdoses were increasing, and families were struggling to cope. The government stepped in with force, launching what would become known as the war on drugs. The idea was simple: cut supply, punish dealers, and scare users into quitting. Unfortunately, the reality was far more complicated. Law enforcement efforts ramped up. Police conducted raids, border patrols tried to intercept shipments, and stricter sentencing laws were put in place. The focus was on punishment, not treatment. Dealers went to prison, users faced legal consequences, and communities were caught in the crossfire. Heroin didn't go away, it just adapted. Black markets grew, cartels became more organized, and the substance continued to flow into cities across the country. Mass incarceration became a key part of the strategy. Thousands of people, many from already marginalized communities, were imprisoned for possession or distribution of heroin. Families were torn apart, and social structures were strained. The punishment-focused approach did little to reduce demand, and for many users, prison was just a pause in the cycle of addiction. Meanwhile, the heroin trade became increasingly sophisticated. As enforcement tightened in one region, supply routes shifted. Southeast Asia, the traditional source, remained important, but Afghanistan began to emerge as a key producer. Cartels learned to exploit instability, borders, and weak law enforcement to move the drug efficiently. Heroin had become a global business, and the chemical itself remained unchanged: potent, addictive, and highly desirable. Communities felt the consequences firsthand. Streets once familiar became areas of risk, neighborhoods saw increased crime, and families watched loved ones struggle. Addiction was no longer hidden or confined to subcultures. It had spread widely, affecting people of all ages, backgrounds, and professions. The social impact was enormous, even as many policymakers continued to focus narrowly on law enforcement. Treatment options were limited. At the time, addiction was largely seen as a moral failing rather than a medical or neurological condition. Methadone programs existed but were restricted, and harm reduction was a concept few were willing to explore. Users were often punished rather than helped, leaving many to navigate withdrawal, cravings, and the risks of black market heroin alone. The war on drugs also had unintended consequences. As supply routes shifted and cartels became richer, the structure of the drug trade changed. Violence increased, street-level distribution became riskier, and new forms of heroin emerged, sometimes purer, sometimes cut with dangerous additives. The very strategies intended to reduce use often made it more dangerous for those still dependent. Society was caught in a paradox. Heroin remained chemically the same, yet the context around it had transformed. Urban decay, social inequality, and economic challenges meant that demand persisted, even as enforcement intensified. People seeking relief, escape, or comfort were not deterred by laws or raids. The drug had become both a symbol of rebellion and a harsh reality for those addicted. Families continued to struggle in private. Children grew up seeing parents wrestle with dependence. Siblings and spouses tried to help, often without the knowledge or tools to do so effectively. Shame, stigma, and secrecy were still pervasive, making recovery harder. Heroin's personal impact was invisible to many, even as its social impact became increasingly obvious. Cartels and trafficking networks adapted quickly. When one route was blocked, another opened. When law enforcement intercepted shipments, prices went up and risk increased. The economics of supply and demand ensured that heroin remained available, often at higher risk and cost to users. The chemical hadn't changed, but the world around it certainly had. Cultural perceptions were also shifting. Heroin was no longer a glamorous symbol of rebellion or artistic inspiration. It had become dangerous, criminalized, and deeply stigmatized. Users were often vilified, and communities struggled to respond with compassion. At the same time, fascination with the drug persisted, a dangerous combination that allowed the black market to thrive. By the late 1970s and early 1980s, it was clear that the war on drugs was not eliminating heroin. Addiction persisted, cartels grew richer, and users continued to seek out the substance. The chemical reality remained unchanged. Heroin was potent, addictive, and capable of devastating lives. What had changed was the social and legal environment, which often made the problem more complicated rather than solving it. Heroin's story during this period highlights the challenges of addressing addiction in a society that prioritizes punishment over treatment. The substance itself was unchanged, yet the context around it, legal, social, economic, transformed the experience of using and obtaining it. Communities, families, and policymakers were all learning difficult lessons. At the same time, the human stories continued. Ordinary people, from soldiers to students to urban workers, wrestled with the chemical and social forces around them. Withdrawal, cravings, and the risk of overdose were daily realities. Families tried to help, friends tried to intervene, but the tools available were limited. Heroin remained a hidden force, shaping lives quietly but powerfully. The war on drugs set the stage for future crises. It taught that supply-side interventions alone were insufficient. Addiction persisted despite laws, raids, and imprisonment. The chemical nature of heroin, combined with human demand and social complexity, meant that prohibition could not fully contain it. The lessons of this era would influence policy and culture for decades to come. By the end of this period, heroin had firmly established itself as a substance that transcended medicine, culture, and geography. It was no longer a countercultural novelty or a pharmaceutical miracle. It was a global challenge, a social crisis, and a deeply personal struggle for those caught in its grip. And so, as governments declared wars, cartels adapted, and families struggled, heroin continued its quiet, relentless journey. Always the same chemical, yet profoundly shaped by the human world around it. Its story was far from over, and the next chapters would reveal even more complex intersections of politics, economics, and human desire. By the late 1970s, the world's heroin supply was shifting again, this time toward Afghanistan. Political instability, conflict, and war created conditions perfectly suited for opium production. Farmers who had little choice in the matter grew poppies because it was more profitable and more resilient than other crops. The chemical that had once been a pharmacy marvel was now tied to a global network of conflict, poverty, and survival. The Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in 1979 escalated the situation. Violence and instability made traditional agriculture and governance nearly impossible. Warlords, militias, and local leaders controlled regions of land, taxing farmers and facilitating opium cultivation. Heroin production wasn't just a criminal enterprise, it became intertwined with the economics of survival. For many, growing poppies was a matter of life, not choice. At the same time, the demand from the West remained strong. The United States and Europe were consuming heroin at increasing rates, sometimes unaware of the sources. The chemistry hadn't changed. Heroin was still potent, addictive, and dangerous, but the pathways from crop to user had become more global and complicated. Afghanistan emerged as a key node in this supply chain. The journey from poppy to street drug involved multiple layers. Farmers grew the opium, local warlords controlled transport and taxation, labs refined it into morphine and then heroin, and traffickers moved it across borders. The entire process was shaped by politics, economics, and conflict. Heroin had become more than a medicine or an addiction problem. It was now a geopolitical factor. Western intelligence agencies took note. In some cases, operations in the region indirectly intersected with the heroin trade. Covert conflicts, Cold War politics, and proxy wars all influenced supply and distribution. Heroin became entangled in international strategy, a chemical constant within a shifting global chessboard. The 1980s and 1990s saw a massive influx of Afghan heroin into Europe and the United States. Routes through Pakistan, Iran, and Turkey ensured that the drug reached major cities efficiently. Cartels became more sophisticated, using modern logistics and networks to meet growing demand. The global economy of addiction was becoming fully industrialized, and Afghanistan was at its center. Farmers and local communities often had little say in the process. Poverty and lack of opportunity made opium a necessity, while global demand guaranteed a market. Addiction in the West drove production in the East, creating a tragic symmetry. The people growing the raw material were rarely the ones using the final product, yet their lives were profoundly shaped by its value. Afghanistan's role also highlighted a cruel irony. The very chemical that once promised relief and modernity in Europe and America was now sustained by hardship, conflict, and coercion thousands of miles away. Heroin had moved far from its origins in German laboratories and pharmacies, becoming a global commodity with human consequences on multiple continents. Meanwhile, addiction continued to rise in Western countries. The supply of Afghan heroin was cheap, pure, and widely available in urban centers. Communities struggled with rising rates of dependence, overdoses, and social disruption. Governments tried to respond with enforcement, but the scale of the problem made containment difficult. The chemistry of heroin remained constant, but the social and political environment around it had grown exponentially more complex. The story of Afghan heroin also highlights the human cost. Farmers risked their lives in conflict zones, traffickers faced violence and arrest, and users navigated addiction in a world that often criminalized them rather than helped them. Heroin had become a force that touched lives in many unexpected ways, connecting rural fields in Afghanistan to city streets in Europe and America. This era also introduced a darker sophistication to the trade. Labs became more efficient, routes more secure, and distribution networks more adaptable. Cartels learned from past enforcement efforts, constantly shifting methods to avoid capture. Heroin was no longer just a drug. It was a product with supply chains, profit margins, and global logistics. The Afghan connection also emphasized the cyclical nature of heroin. Political instability created production, which fed addiction, which fueled demand, which encouraged further cultivation. It was a loop with human consequences on both ends. Farmers depended on the crop, users depended on the chemical, and intermediaries, warlords, traffickers, and cartels, thrived in the space between. Families in consuming countries were affected in increasingly visible ways. Addiction tore at households, strained communities, and contributed to urban decay. Traditional methods of intervention, medical treatment, law enforcement, or social support, were often inadequate to meet the scale of the problem. The Afghan connection had turned heroin into a global crisis, with consequences far beyond what anyone had imagined a century earlier. Yet even in this complex, interconnected world, the substance itself remained the same. Heroin's chemical reality, potent, addictive, and capable of devastating human lives, had not changed. What had changed was the scale, the geography, and the social and political implications. It was a chemical constant in an increasingly chaotic human world. By the 1990s, the Afghan wave of heroin was well established. European cities saw rising addiction rates, U.S. cities experienced increased demand, and Afghanistan remained the primary source. The world had come full circle from pharmacy to epidemic, from laboratory to global supply chain. Heroin was no longer a miracle drug or a countercultural accessory. It was a global industry, a geopolitical factor, and a deeply personal challenge for millions of users. The Afghan connection is a stark reminder of how a substance can evolve far beyond its original context. What began as a laboratory marvel in 19th-century Germany had become entwined with war, politics, economics, and human suffering across continents. The journey of heroin shows that chemicals may stay the same, but the human world around them changes, often in ways that are hard to predict and even harder to control. And so, heroin continued its quiet, relentless journey, touching lives from the mountains of Afghanistan to the streets of New York, Marseille, and beyond. The chemistry hadn't changed, but the world had, creating a complex web of dependency, profit, and human cost that would shape the story of addiction for decades to come. By the turn of the millennium, heroin was no longer confined to city streets or countercultural circles. A new wave of addiction was spreading, and this time it was reaching suburbs, small towns, and communities that had never before been exposed to the drug. The story began with prescription painkillers, like OxyContin, flooding the market in the late 1990s. Doctors, seeking to relieve chronic pain, prescribed them widely, often unaware of how addictive these opioids could be. For many, prescription painkillers were a solution. They alleviated pain from injuries, surgeries, and chronic conditions. People trusted them. They came from doctors, after all. But over time, a troubling pattern emerged. As tolerance grew and prescriptions ran out, users sought alternatives. That's where heroin stepped in. Affordable, potent, and widely available, it became the next step for many who had never imagined touching street drugs. The demographics of addiction were changing. Suburban teens, office workers, and even professionals found themselves caught in the grip of opioids. Heroin wasn't just a problem for inner-city neighborhoods anymore. It was spreading quietly into communities that often assumed they were safe. Parents, teachers, and neighbors struggled to recognize the signs, and stigma prevented open discussion. Addiction was now a hidden crisis in plain sight. The transition from prescription pills to heroin was alarmingly easy for many. The chemistry was similar, the high was familiar, and the cost was often lower than pharmaceutical alternatives. Dealers quickly noticed the demand and adapted. Routes that had once supplied urban centers now extended to suburban towns. Heroin was no longer just a city problem. It had become a national issue. Synthetic opioids, like fentanyl, later amplified the crisis. Even small amounts were highly potent, leading to overdoses and deaths at an unprecedented scale. For users, the line between medicine and poison blurred. What had begun as a controlled pharmaceutical experiment had morphed into a public health emergency, affecting millions across multiple generations. Families faced unimaginable challenges. Children watched parents struggle with dependency, siblings tried to intervene without guidance, and entire communities were forced to confront a problem that had seemed distant just a few years earlier. The shame and secrecy that had marked earlier epidemics persisted, making recovery harder and more isolating. Addiction wasn't a moral failure, it was a neurological reality, but society wasn't always ready to accept that truth. Communities tried to respond, but infrastructure lagged behind demand. Treatment programs were limited, and harm reduction strategies were often controversial. Schools, workplaces, and healthcare providers struggled to adapt. Law enforcement, still focused on street-level heroin from earlier waves, wasn't fully equipped to address suburban or rural addiction. The crisis required a shift in thinking, one that took time to develop. Meanwhile, the drug trade adapted once again. Cartels and traffickers shifted supply routes to meet the new demand. Mexican cartels, in particular, became key players in supplying heroin to suburban areas in the United States. The chemical didn't change, but the networks distributing it became more sophisticated, more efficient, and harder to trace. Heroin had become a product shaped by global markets, local demand, and criminal ingenuity. Public perception of addiction was slowly evolving. Awareness campaigns and media coverage began to highlight that opioid dependency could affect anyone, regardless of background or socioeconomic status. This helped challenge earlier stereotypes about heroin users, but it didn't immediately solve the underlying problems. Families and individuals were still grappling with stigma, secrecy, and the immense difficulty of recovery. The crisis also exposed gaps in medical practice. Prescribers had underestimated the addictive potential of opioids, patients had not always been fully informed, and follow-up care was inconsistent. Lessons from the past, when heroin moved from pharmacy counters to streets, had not been fully learned. History was repeating itself, albeit in a new context, and the consequences were widespread. Addiction's human toll became increasingly visible. Overdoses rose, emergency rooms filled with cases of dependency-related complications, and deaths mounted. Communities mourned quietly while policymakers debated solutions. The chemical that had once been heralded as a miracle in the 19th century was now a modern plague, quietly shaping lives, families, and social structures. Even as the epidemic unfolded, there were signs of hope. Awareness of addiction as a medical issue, rather than purely a legal or moral one, began to take root. Harm reduction strategies, supervised injection programs, and addiction medicine gained traction. Individuals and families started finding pathways to recovery, demonstrating resilience in the face of a complex chemical and social challenge. The new epidemic also highlighted an uncomfortable truth: addiction doesn't stay in one place. Heroin's journey from laboratories, pharmacies, and inner cities now extended to the very communities that had once assumed immunity. Geography, class, or status offered no protection. The chemistry remained constant, but human behavior, social structures, and market dynamics ensured that heroin remained a persistent challenge. By the early 2000s, it was clear that this was not a localized problem, it was a national crisis. Heroin, once a medicinal marvel, had become both a suburban and urban threat, intricately tied to pharmaceutical practices, global trafficking, and human behavior. Communities were learning, often painfully, that chemical dependence could affect anyone, and that historical patterns of addiction could repeat in modern forms. The story of heroin in this era is a reminder that substances don't exist in isolation. They interact with human desire, social norms, economics, and policy. The opioid crisis of the 2000s is not just about a drug, it's about human behavior, trust, desperation, and adaptation. Heroin's chemical consistency collided with shifting human environments, producing widespread consequences that touched millions of lives. And so, from the streets to the suburbs, heroin continued its journey. The drug had evolved in its social context, but its chemical power remained unchanged. Families struggled, communities responded, and society was forced to confront the same lessons it had learned, often too late. Heroin's story had entered a new chapter, one that reminded the world that the line between medicine and poison is sometimes frighteningly thin. By the 2000s, society was starting to understand heroin and addiction differently. After centuries of punishment, stigma, and secrecy, a new perspective was emerging. Addiction is not a moral failing, it's a neurological reality. Scientists discovered that prolonged use of opioids rewires the brain's reward system, creating a dependence that is biological as well as psychological. This shifted the conversation from blame to understanding, opening the door to treatment and compassion. Treatments began to diversify. Methadone and buprenorphine provided safer alternatives to manage withdrawal and cravings. Supervised injection programs emerged in some cities, offering a place for users to use heroin under medical supervision while connecting them with resources. These approaches were controversial at first, but they highlighted a simple truth: addiction is complex, and punitive measures alone do not work. The science of addiction helped explain what users and families had experienced for generations. Heroin doesn't just relieve pain or produce euphoria, it alters the brain. Dopamine surges, tolerance builds, and withdrawal symptoms create a cycle that is incredibly hard to break. Understanding this chemical and neurological reality reframed addiction as a medical condition rather than a personal weakness. Families could finally grasp that it wasn't about laziness or bad choices. It was about biology, environment, and circumstance. Recovery stories began to emerge. Ordinary people, who had once been hidden by shame and stigma, shared their journeys. Soldiers who had brought heroin home from wars, suburban teens caught in the opioid crisis, urban workers trapped in cycles of addiction. All of them found paths forward through treatment, support, and community programs. Their experiences humanized the issue and inspired both hope and practical solutions. Compassion became central to new strategies. Harm reduction, education, and social services worked alongside medical treatment. Communities began to recognize that punishing addiction often worsened it. Families were encouraged to support recovery rather than stigmatize it. Users found a new level of dignity in being understood rather than condemned. The focus shifted from blame to healing. Science, however, was only part of the picture. Social support, empathy, and policy changes were equally important. Programs that combined counseling, vocational training, and peer support proved most effective. Addiction wasn't a standalone chemical problem. It was entwined with social environment, economic opportunity, and mental health. Recovery required attention to all these factors, a lesson that societies had been slow to learn. Despite these advancements, challenges remained. Heroin and other opioids were still highly potent, addictive, and dangerous. Fentanyl and other synthetic opioids amplified the risks, creating new public health emergencies. Even with treatment and support, relapse was common, and access to care was uneven. The struggle against addiction was ongoing, a constant battle between chemical reality and human resilience. The cultural perception of heroin began to shift as well. Where once it had been romanticized, demonized, or hidden, it was now recognized as a public health issue. Media coverage, education campaigns, and advocacy groups worked to reduce stigma and provide information. Society began to see users as people struggling with a medical condition, not as criminals or failures. This change in perception was slow but essential. Technology also played a role. Telemedicine, online support groups, and better tracking of prescription opioids helped communities respond more effectively. Research into pharmacology and neuroscience continued, offering hope for new treatments and harm reduction strategies. The modern fight against heroin was increasingly evidence-based, moving beyond fear and ideology. Personal stories remained central. Individuals who had survived addiction shared their experiences, offering guidance, empathy, and cautionary tales. Veterans, suburban teens, urban workers, all contributed to a growing understanding of the human side of the crisis. These narratives reminded society that heroin is not just a chemical, not just a criminal issue. It is a deeply personal challenge with ripple effects across families and communities. Recovery also revealed resilience. People rebuilt lives, returned to work, reconnected with families, and found purpose beyond the drug. Their stories were reminders that even in the darkest periods, recovery is possible. Heroin had destroyed lives for centuries, but with science, sympathy, and structured support, many people could reclaim theirs. The ongoing battle between stigma and science continued to shape the conversation. Communities debated policies, treatment approaches, and harm reduction strategies. Families learned to balance compassion with vigilance. Governments tried to reconcile law enforcement with public health. Through it all, heroin remained chemically constant, but human understanding and response were evolving. Heroin's journey in this era shows the importance of knowledge and empathy. Understanding addiction as a medical condition does not erase the pain or risk, but it allows for solutions that work. Science explains the chemical and neurological mechanisms, and compassion addresses the social and emotional dimensions. Together, they offer a path toward recovery that had been missing for centuries. Even as challenges persisted, there was hope. The history of heroin, from a miracle medicine to a global epidemic, served as a cautionary tale. Society was learning to respond not just with laws or punishment, but with understanding, treatment, and prevention. Families, communities, and medical professionals were becoming better equipped to help those affected. And so, in this modern era, heroin remains a chemical constant, but our understanding of its impact is evolving. Science, sympathy, and structured support offer pathways for recovery, proving that even the most entrenched addictions can be addressed with knowledge, compassion, and persistence. The story of heroin is not only one of chemical dependency but of human resilience, understanding, and hope. Looking back, it's striking how heroin has traveled through history. From the labs of 19th-century Germany, where it was hailed as a miracle drug, to the streets and suburbs of modern cities, its journey reflects both human ingenuity and human vulnerability. What started as hope, relief, and scientific progress became a complex tale of addiction, suffering, and resilience. It's a story that teaches lessons about chemistry, culture, and compassion. The early days were full of optimism. Scientists and pharmacists marveled at heroin's potency and apparent safety. It was celebrated as a cough suppressant, a pain reliever, a substitute for morphine. Families trusted it, doctors prescribed it, and society embraced it. Yet, almost immediately, signs of dependency began to emerge. The miracle carried a hidden cost, a cost that would ripple through generations. Over time, heroin became more than a medicine. It intertwined with wars, social upheaval, cultural rebellion, and global trade. Soldiers carried it from battlefields to hometowns, jazz musicians experimented with it in smoky clubs, and suburban teens encountered it through prescription opioids. Each era added layers to its story, showing that the substance itself remained constant while human context continually changed. The chemical hasn't changed. Heroin remains potent, addictive, and dangerous. What has changed are society's responses and our understanding. Early reliance on punishment and moral judgment often failed to curb its impact. Later, science and empathy began to offer more effective approaches. This duality, between the unchanging chemistry and the evolving human story, is a central theme of heroin's history. Addiction, once hidden in Victorian parlors or battlefield hospitals, became visible in urban streets, suburban homes, and international headlines. Families struggled, communities responded, and societies debated how best to manage the crisis. Each wave of heroin use revealed new insights about human behavior, medical practice, and the limits of law enforcement. Yet the human desire to relieve pain, escape suffering, or seek pleasure remained constant. Even as heroin caused harm, it also prompted progress. Medical understanding of addiction evolved, leading to treatments like methadone, buprenorphine, and supervised injection programs. Harm reduction strategies began to emerge, offering safety and dignity to users. Social perspectives slowly shifted, moving from blame and shame to compassion and support. In a way, the human response matured, even if the substance did not. The global scale of the problem became apparent in the 20th and 21st centuries. Afghanistan, Southeast Asia, and Latin America became central nodes in production and trafficking. Cartels, warlords, and smugglers created networks that spanned continents. Meanwhile, communities in the West faced the consequences in rising addiction rates, overdoses, and social disruption. Heroin had moved far from its laboratory origins, but its impact remained deeply personal. What remains most striking is how heroin reflects human behavior. It thrives in times of pain, upheaval, and curiosity. People seek it for relief, for escape, or for pleasure, often unaware of the risks. Society responds with laws, treatment, or education, but the substance adapts. Its chemistry is constant, but its social and cultural effects are endlessly variable. This interplay between fixed chemical reality and shifting human context is the essence of its story. Families continue to feel the ripple effects. Children grow up witnessing parents struggle, siblings intervene without adequate support, and communities cope with the consequences. Addiction touches lives quietly and profoundly. It reminds us that behind every statistic is a human story, a person who once trusted in a miracle and is now navigating its consequences. The story of heroin also reminds us to question blind faith in progress. Science and innovation can bring immense benefits, but without responsibility and understanding, they can also create harm. Early users trusted in medicine, later societies relied on law enforcement, and yet the underlying human patterns, desire for relief, vulnerability to addiction, social dynamics, remained consistent. Heroin's history is a cautionary tale about power, trust, and oversight. Yet, amid all the tragedy, there is resilience. People survive addiction, communities recover, and society learns. Modern approaches that combine medical treatment, social support, and empathy provide paths forward. Heroin remains dangerous, but our understanding and ability to respond have grown. Each story of recovery, each harm reduction program, is a reminder that progress is possible even in the face of enduring challenges. Looking at the arc of history, heroin's journey is a mirror. It reflects the brilliance of human innovation, the pain of dependency, the complexity of society, and the enduring need for compassion. From the first miracle elixirs to today's opioid crisis, it's a story about chemistry, yes, but also about humanity, our mistakes, our resilience, and our capacity to learn. As we end this chapter, it's worth pausing to reflect. The story of heroin is not just about a drug, it's about people. Ordinary people, extraordinary circumstances, and the choices that connect them. It's about understanding that relief can come with a cost, that progress is rarely without risk, and that compassion can be as powerful as any chemical intervention. So tonight, as you rest, remember this: heroin's history is a journey through human ambition, error, and perseverance. It teaches us caution, curiosity, and empathy. The miracle may have deceived the world once, but understanding its story helps us navigate the present. Sleep knowing that history is not just a record of events, it's a guide, a warning, and sometimes a quiet source of hope. And that's the story for tonight. If you found this journey through history as fascinating as I did, make sure to stick around for more. Here on CuriosityQuest, we explore the hidden stories of our past, the ones you won't find in textbooks, perfect for bedtime listening or quiet reflection. If you enjoyed this video, hit that like button to show some love, and don't forget to subscribe. It's the easiest way to make sure you never miss a new story, and it really helps support the channel so I can keep bringing these tales to life. And hey, if you really want to dive deeper, hit the notification bell so you'll know the moment the next story goes live. We've got plenty more mysteries, histories, and curiosities waiting for you. Thanks for listening, and until next time, may your dreams be filled with history, wonder, and maybe just a touch of mischief.